I'm Sean Halsall, and this is What's Left. Hi everyone, and apologies, it's been a couple of weeks after the 8-hour election marathon we did, but without further ado, I'll bring in one of our co-hosts, Laura. Hi, Laura.
Hi, all right. I'm still tired from the election special. I've not recovered.
It was brutal, and Renee is definitely still not recovered, being in California herself. So, special guest this evening, Andrew Feinstein, author of Shadow Worlds, Exposing the Global Arms Trade, and regular contributor on Double Down News, and I think it's Declassified. Is that right, Andrew?
Yeah.
Excellent. So, how are you doing? So, an interesting year for you so far. Stood against the leader of the Labour Party and our now Prime Minister, massively reducing his majority. How did that feel at the time?
It was quite an experience. So Keir Starmer is my local constituency MP. And for a number of years, I've had people in the community saying, won't you stand, won't you stand? And my feeling was very strongly that we needed to involve the community in making a decision and try and find if there was a better, for which read, amongst other things, younger, in other words, not an old white male, to stand against Starmer. And eventually, I was persuaded to do it. It was an extraordinary experience. It really was. You know, the guy is really unpopular, even in his own constituency. Almost half of those who voted, and of course it was an historically low turnout, but almost half of those who voted in his own constituency didn't vote for him. He became the first person in British electoral history to enter 10 Downing Street, having not increased his own personal majority. And in fact, as you say, saw it slashed by 50%. But I think what was best about the experience was we knocked on about 50,000 doors. And just being able to engage with people in the area that I've lived in all 23 years I've lived in the UK, because as you can hear from my accent, I'm not originally from here. And I think people really just appreciated being listened to and realizing that there was an alternative. And the fact that so many of them voted for an independent candidate, which is unheard of in this very, very safe Labour seat, was amazing. And I was also very lucky to have an incredible election team. You know, so many volunteers locally from around the country. And even, I mean, we had someone come down from Ireland for about 3 weeks. We had someone fly in from Dubai to participate in the campaign. We had someone from Egypt who came especially. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. And it shows how transparent Starmer and his personal positions and his politics are, that so many people felt moved to want to mobilize against him. But I think the most extraordinary thing for me was the number of doors I knocked on personally, where people would sort of look at the pamphlet we put through their door and then look at me and say, are you this guy? And I'd say, yeah. And they'd say sort of something along the lines of, well, what are you doing here? And I'd say, what do you mean? And they'd say, well, I don't even know who my MP is, let alone actually ever see the person. I don't even know who my councillor is, let alone see the person. And I said, well, do you not think that if someone wants to represent you, if they want your vote, shouldn't they be engaging with you? Shouldn't they be a part of your community? And quite a lot of people said, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And at one level, it's a bit sad. But I think that we are at a point in our politics in this country where people are just fed up and they're looking for something different.
Yeah, we see it, don't we, here and in America recently with sort of polarization of politics. The center ground offers nothing anymore.
Absolutely.
People, if there isn't a strong left offering a proper transformative source of politics, like in 2017 and 19 we had, then people will sway to the far right and them sort of more nefarious aspects of politics. And I think someone explained to me best, not explained, but someone offering something will always beat someone offering nothing in politics, regardless of if that something is sort of toxic and built on sand. It's
absolutely.
Definitely. I think we've seen sort of the backlash of that as well. From people are so fed up with mainstream establishment politics that then these characters that come through that seem like an anti-establishment person, like your Donald Trump, your Boris Johnsons, Nigel Farage, when their big selling point really is, I'm not like them. I'll say these outlandish things that people think are the truth, because they must be, because they're so outlandish that people will respond with the votes because they think that they're completely anti-establishment, when in truth these billionaires are not.
Exactly.
Billionaire Donald Trump anti-establishment, and
well, exactly. Well, and our version, be it Boris Johnson, the ultimate being born with a silver spoon in your mouth and spitting the spoon out because you're such a spoilt, entitled brat. Or Nigel Farage, who was a city banker for decades, very, very wealthy man, who, came to prominence around Brexit. But the day after the Brexit vote was queuing outside the German embassy to make sure that he got his German passport from his then wife before she discovered he was having an affair. And these are the people we think are going to change anything? This is just them playing their little political parlor games to see who's going to land up on top of the establishment heap. And I think one of the things that we have to do as progressives or the left is we've got to start talking to people who see the Johnsons, the Sunaks, the Badenochs, the Farages as any part of the solution and make clear to them that they're all equal part of the problem, as is Donald Trump.
And as are the sort of the liberals of the world, Macrons and Starmers and Kamala Harris. These people aren't the answer. They don't offer anything other than the status quo. And we've seen how that's gone over the last sort of 40, 50 years in this country since Thatcher, tearing out the sort of industrial heartlands. There's working class people don't have anything to hope for or to grasp onto anymore, and we need to return that hope. I mean, at the minute, it's about fighting to keep what we've got. The NHS, it's already massively underfunded, and education, where our schools are crumbling on top of our kids' heads. And that's it. If we're just fighting to keep what we've got, we're never going to get our heads up and start fighting for new stuff, the stuff that we should be enjoying.
So, I mean, it's very interesting now because liberalism, centralism, if you want. I mean, I've seen it at play in apartheid South Africa, where I grew up and where I cut my political teeth in the struggle against apartheid. And, the centrists, I mean, let's have apartheid, but make it a little bit nicer, which, so we can't have a democratic election because then the majority of people in the country will be in charge. And we don't want that, obviously. So how about if we have 340 years of racist oligarchy, and then we give a qualified vote, where if you own property or you have a certain level of education, you can vote. In other words, you're white. Basically, this was their solution. And, that's not dissimilar to the sort of solutions that liberalism and centricism poses to our problems today. Let's continue what we're doing, but let's have better PR doing it.
Absolutely.
In fact, the big problem with Keir Starmer is that his PR is so bad. That's what the liberals are supposed to be good at. I mean, however much one hated Tony Blair, and as a war profiteer, as a war criminal, I mean, I have particular detestation of the man. But, you have to admit, he was quite a good speaker. He was quite good at marketing himself and his party and his so-called ideas, which were completely vacuous and empty. But the PR was damn good. Starmer doesn't have that. He's just a dislikable person who's really shit at politics.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, it's not, I think that what we're seeing now in Britain is that we're seeing not only that what the Liberals offer is empty, but they can't even present it anymore. And in order to maintain the status quo as it is, from which they benefit politically and materially, we're now seeing them get more and more reactionary, more and more repressive. We sit in the middle of a situation where what this Labour government is effectively saying in charging activists, be it climate activists or pro-Palestine activists and journalists, under anti-terrorism legislation. And that's all they've got left is, they can't win arguments. They're not going to give the people who need money from the state, they're not going to give them any money. So what they're giving them is effectively an evolution towards more and more of a police state.
Absolutely. I just want to go back there because you mentioned about how you cut your teeth in politics. So what was there a moment which sort of triggered that political awakening in you in South Africa? What was that?
So I had a really weird upbringing. My mother was Austrian. So she grew up in Vienna, Jewish. She survived the Holocaust by being hidden in a coal cellar for 3.5 years, most of the time. And whenever there was a Gestapo or SS raid in her area, which was a working class suburb of Vienna, she'd get rolled up into a carpet and the carpet would be put up against the wall and coal packed around it. And she used to tell my sister and I, when she spoke about it, that, she didn't know which scared her more, the fact that she could barely breathe because of the coal dust, or hearing the soldiers trying to shoot out the lock in the coal cellar door, which fortunately was incredibly thick steel. And she then came to London after the Second World War, met my dad, who was South African. And then they went back to South Africa together. And she, who had been taught this idea of, never again, we must never have another Holocaust again. Her understanding of never again, which is the obvious and commonsensical understanding, is that never again is for the entire world and for all human beings. She arrives in South Africa where the vast majority of people are being brutally oppressed. And she says to herself, well, Black Africans are being treated like Jews in Europe were treated by the Nazis. And in fact, the South African government post-Second World War was a neo-Nazi government. They'd all been jailed during the war for their Nazi sympathies and activities. And she got involved in the struggle against apartheid and would take me from a very young age during my school holidays. I'd have to either go into townships or squatter settlements with her illegally, or she worked as a puppeteer in non-racial theater. And so I'd have to go to the theater with her. And I didn't realize at the time, but the people hanging around in this theater were like South Africa's greatest playwright, some of our greatest actors, a guy who was in his 20s then, who became a world famous jazz pianist, now known as Abdullah Ibrahim, who then went by the brilliant name Dollar Brand. And, I got to know Abdullah when I was a little kid. He'd be plonking away on the piano, and I'd wonder who this cool dude was who was playing the piano while I was just sort of passing the time. But I suppose the real moment for me came when I first went into a squatter settlement just outside Cape Town, a place called Crossroads, which had about 70,000 shacks that were built from little pieces of tin, pieces of wood, bricks, cardboard, whatever people could find. And these were all people who were illegally in the area because they didn't have the right stamp in their passbook, their racist ID document to be there. Looking for work. They were effectively economic migrants from other parts of the country who were treated the worst of the worst. And it was a very militant squatter camp. And regularly the security forces would move in and would just demolish most of the shacks. And I once went in there and Cape Town, which is a brilliant climate usually, for a couple of months in winter, it's really awful. It's like Britain is most of the year. It's wet and windy and cold. And I just saw these sort of makeshift beds in pouring rain, with the adults sitting on the beds, with all of their possessions around them, and the kids under the beds in the mud, but trying to get away from the rain. And I must have been about 12 when I first saw this. And I just remember thinking, how can human beings treat other human beings like this?
Yeah.
How can some of us, because, my family were quite middle class and we lived a comfortable life, as virtually all white South Africans did. I thought, how can some of us have nice cars, and let alone nice houses and clothes and stuff, where others literally don't even have a roof over their head?
Mm.
And I think that for me was the awakening. And then it developed into an understanding, just seeing the graffiti, getting to know people, that the ANC was really, most of these people, the vast majority, saw the ANC as their leaders. And of course, it was a banned organization. You weren't allowed to have images of any of the leadership or of the party. You weren't allowed to have anything that the party had ever said or its leaders had ever said or written. But when you spend time in townships, which, in 1994, when we became a democracy, 0.04% of white South Africans had ever set foot in a black township. That's how separate, physically separate we were. And black South Africans would travel into white areas to work in menial jobs for very little, and then be sent back to their area to sleep. And I suppose it was this realization that even though when I looked in a mirror, I saw a very pale face, that wasn't where I belonged. That wasn't where I felt comfortable. It was in the townships with people who lived another reality, who saw, and this is the crucial point for me, I think, they saw the possibilities of a different future.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what really attracted me to the struggle and to politics, because it was so obvious to me that our politics were just a complete farce.
Mm-hmm.
So them first years, because you sat in the South African Parliament for a bit.
Yes. So what happened was I had to leave the country in the mid-'80s because I got involved in the struggle in various ways. But also all white males had to do 2 years service in the apartheid military. And I managed to avoid going into the military by studying endlessly. And then eventually, at a moment in the mid-1980s, when again, all 70,000 shacks and crossroads were burnt down. Over 170 people killed who were in their shacks during the day when they were burned down. And I, again, illegally went into the squatter settlement with about 20 other students. I was a student at the University of Cape Town at the time. And we just tried to help those families. Mm-hmm. And that's when I attended my first ever ANC underground meeting without even realizing it was a meeting of the ANC underground. And, when you in that sort of struggle where the organization is illegal and banned, there are no membership forms to sign. Mm-hmm. But if you attend a meeting, and of course, I didn't know anybody's actual names, and I was told not to give mine. You're recruited without realizing it. And so soon after that, I was called to the military, the point where you go to start your military service, called the Castle in Cape Town, an old fort built by the first colonial settlers in 1652. And they said to me, you have to report for military service on this day. Your study deferment has ended. Mm-hmm. And we're sending you back into Crossroads where we know you've been active in uniform. And that was the point at which I realized I was either going to have to go to jail or I was going to get out of the country. And frankly, I didn't have the courage to go to jail. And so I got out of the country at very short notice. And I was very fortunate. I never describe it as exile because I studied. I studied in the US, I studied in Britain with the help of the ANC. And I then, as soon as the ANC was unbanned and our political prisoners were released and our process of transition started, I could go back along with the exiles, the tens of thousands of exiles. And I worked as a facilitator in the constitutional negotiations that led to our first democratic election in 94. And I was elected as an ANC MP in that election. So I served in the first democratic parliament when Mandela was president, which was quite an experience. Because, you know, for the 4 years that he was president of both the country and the ANC, everything was done in the national interest. It wasn't done in terms of what was best for the ANC. It was done in terms of what was best for the country. He had already said he'd only serve one term, so he didn't need to be popular. He didn't need to be an ordinary, normal politician. He could just be the person he was, which was pretty damn extraordinary. And it was an incredible, incredible experience that I was way beyond privileged to play a part in, given, you know, that I'd only benefited from apartheid. But it soon changed. And it changed when his successor, Thabo Mbeki, decided to spend $10 billion on weapons. Weapons that we didn't need, that we barely used until today. And the only reason they did it was about $350 million of bribes were paid, including the biggest bribe paid by BAE Systems, the British arms company, with a lot of help from Tony Blair, who made 3 visits to South Africa to seal the deal, because BAE won one of the biggest contracts on the whole arms deal that they weren't even shortlisted for because they didn't meet a whole lot of the technical specifications. But they paid the biggest bribe, 115 million pounds. And, you know, it was incredible when I started investigating this deal, because I ran the Public Accounts Committee in Parliament, the sort of financial oversight committee. And when I was meeting with prosecutors about what had gone on in this deal, I discovered that during the negotiations, so before we even became a democracy, there were these guys hanging around in the negotiations, far better dressed than any of us. And they were executives from the world's leading arms companies. And they were there telling Mbeki, who they knew would effectively be Mandela's prime minister, and Joe Modise, who they knew would be our first post-apartheid defense minister, saying to them, listen, an arms deal is exactly what you need, because you do a number of things. You keep the white generals who don't want democracy, you keep them happy by giving them toys, basically, make them feel important. But secondly, it's by far the best way to fund your political party. And then they start talking about the bribes. And, you know, so 4 or 5 years into our incredibly hopeful democracy, Mbeki decides that it's okay to use huge state contracts to fund the party, which was in desperate need of money. And that was just a slippery slope, unfortunately. And corruption in the country has got worse and worse. And it's why I've devoted the last 23 years of my life, because I resigned from Parliament in protest at my own party's refusal to allow my committee an unfettered investigation into the corruption in this deal. Because I thought it was important to speak out for the sake of our young democracy. You know, as Nelson Mandela reminded me constantly, when you became an MP, you took an oath of office to the constitution of the country, not to the ANC. And I've seen, you know, initially I thought in South Africa, because all of us were activists who landed up as ANC MPs. We never expected to be in government or members of parliament. And when I investigated this arms deal and then started investigating the global arms trade, initially I thought we in South Africa had just been naive and stupid. We've been taken for a ride by these very smart global politicians and corporate executives. But then I found out this is what happens all over the world with the arms trade. At the time that BAE and Tony Blair were paying 115 million pounds of bribes in South Africa, they were doing 7 other deals in other parts of the world, mainly the global south, paying over £1 billion of bribes at that one time.
Yeah, it's it's interesting. I mean, the last Labour Party conference, I believe it was in Liverpool, and I believe BAE were one of the biggest sponsors of that. And I'm thinking, how far has this party fallen where we're taking that amount of money? And I mean, it would almost be impressive if it wasn't so heartbreaking how quickly it has fallen. To look back at sort of 2016, 17, 18, when we were all hopeful, and especially after that 2017 election, when we should have done it if it wasn't for the like Tom Watson and co.
Yeah.
But just how quickly sort of that corporate interest has seized the party machinery again, and it's just bought and paid for.
Well, it's like you just said, Andrew. When you mentioned about the time in South Africa where you were in service of the country, in service of the people, not there for the benefit of the party, that's not an ideal that is in anywhere in the Labour Party as they stand in government today. It's completely out of self-interest. Nothing that has been implemented is anything that will be a big benefit to the majority of the population, and we're seeing that across every policy that comes out, that it is just self-interest. Like you say, with these corporate deals, how can we ensure that our corporate backing remains?
It's astonishing. We have a situation where, imagine being a Keir Starmer. You have the prospect of power and you'll do anything at all to get it. This is a human rights lawyer who actually argued cases of genocide, who's now claiming that what's happening in Gaza isn't a genocide. So suddenly he's smarter than the International Court of Justice, the highest court on the planet. And why would he do that? Well, because as an aspiring politician, you look to Tony Blair and you not only see what he did to the party, and let's remember, going back to your point, Sean, about Margaret Thatcher, what did Thatcher describe as her greatest political achievement?
Oh, absolutely, Tony Blair.
Tony Blair. Because he turned, Laura, as you were saying, he turned the Labour Party into a neoliberal warmongering party. But he doesn't. Starmer and his ilk don't only see that. They also see the reality that since leaving office, Tony Blair has earned, in my very conservative estimate, over £110 million personally out of the decision to invade Iraq and the companies who benefited from that, and out of his association with companies like BAE Systems. I mean, him and Sir Richard Evans, who of course he knighted, have been traveling around the world for decades, offering their services to the most autocratic, repugnant dictators on the planet. And so what people like Starmer and, other aspiring centrist Labour people realize is this is how they can become super wealthy. This is how they can become a part of that elite that they think they deserve to be a part of. And the only thing I would tell them is what Nelson Mandela once told us. He walked into a meeting of the ANC Parliamentary Caucus. And he said, knowing exactly what would happen, he said, "So who here thinks you're important?" And of course, a few people put up their hands. At which point he said, "The moment you think you are more important than the people who put you here, the people you represent, that's the point at which you are of no value to those people, to this parliament, to this movement, or to this country." And you look at our MPs today, and how many of them are there purely out of self-interest and don't represent anybody but themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, again, you said it earlier about the sort of anti-protest laws coming in, and any sort of dissent, whether that be young 20-year-olds being dragged out of a Labour Party conference because they dared to challenge the ongoing genocide in Gaza, or any sort of dissent on the streets, whether it be, and I'm 99% sure this legislation will be used against shop stewards and trade unionists who take their workers out on strike at some point soon. It's a matter of time. I think they see themselves very much as Thatcher's legacy themselves now, where I can't remember who it was the other day. I read something the other day or heard something where we had a Labour minister or Secretary of State saying we'll treat the farmers like Thatcher did the miners. And whilst I don't put any sort of stock in the farmers, these plights to not pay tax at the moment, although I think it probably could have been done a lot better. I think just that language of violence to reinvoke what that Tory government did to the mining communities of this country is disgusting and abhorrent, and it should have nowhere. It shouldn't be involved in any sort of thing. Centre, left, centre, soft left, hard left, whatever. It should be nowhere near progressive politics.
Mm-hmm. What I do think will be interesting is you mentioned about climate protesters, and we're seeing some of the farmers organising to do different civil disobedience now and roadblocks, things like that. I think what will be interesting will be to see how that is dealt with in comparison to how we've seen people from like the Just Stop Oil movement, how we've seen them be treated and dealt with and sentenced. Whether there'll be a comparable thing for a comparable roadblock. If apparently all the roads in the UK are going to be blocked across, so I'd be interested to see how that's dealt with.
Absolutely, I think we're at a moment where those of us who are concerned about climate catastrophe, those of us who are concerned about the fact that Britain is not just enabling and facilitating and arming a genocide, but is profiting from it.
Mm-hmm.
We're now being treated like terrorists.
Yeah.
That's what our government is effectively saying to us.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for those of us who've been stuck with Keir Starmer as an MP for almost 10 years, we've always known that his instincts are profoundly undemocratic and authoritarian. Mm-hmm. And we saw that when he was Director of Public Prosecutions. What's really interesting to me when you look at his time at the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, he never allowed the prosecution of an agent of the British state to go ahead. So, during his time there was the case of there was a guy who died when a protest was kettled. The poor old guy wasn't even a part of the protest. He was wandering past and he was curious. And he was kicked and pushed and hit by the police and hit his head on the pavement and had a brain hemorrhage. Prosecution for manslaughter didn't go ahead. Mm-hmm. We look at, again, during his time, there were military personnel, Britain's military personnel, acting completely illegally abroad, Iraq, Afghanistan, committing murder, not prosecuted. And then, of course, the one who did get prosecuted was Julian Assange. And the reality is that if it wasn't for Keir Starmer, Julian Assange would have been released years and years ago when the Swedes said that they didn't have any need for him to remain jailed, but Starmer wanted to keep him in jail until the United States had time to submit its request for his extradition. So, there are all of these things that we said during the election were a portent of the sort of government that Keir Starmer would lead. And we in Holborn and St. Pancras, we had the opportunity to see a change of government, which obviously all of us desperately wanted because the Tories were just so abject. They were just so incompetent and so corrupt. Yeah. But we could have done it without Starmer. And what a shock to the Labour Party system that would have been if their right-wing leader had lost his own seat.
Absolutely. I think, just coming back to your point there on Julian Assange, what sort of world do we live in where we lock up those who expose war crimes whilst the war criminals themselves walk around freely? It's disgusting, isn't it?
It's extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary when, you're a terrorist if you believe that genocide's not such a great thing, but you regard yourself as a statesman when you're playing a part in that genocide, even though you were once a human rights lawyer. I mean, what we've done is we've taken language and we've turned it upside down. So, war is now peace, escalation is de-escalation. I mean, you have, racist football thugs in Amsterdam behaving like racist football thugs, and our political leaders talk about pogroms.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like the madness of the world at the moment. It's completely crazy. And then when you see it in a very basic way in this country, how that manifests is that, today in Britain, we have the largest number of billionaires we've ever had. But we also have more families needing to use food banks than at any time since the end of the Second World War. And how do we allow this? How have we come to that the sixth richest country on the planet has this extreme inequality, that we see people, whose cars cost more money than most of us are going to make in our lifetimes, let alone their homes and their clothes and everything else, while we have thousands and thousands of people living on the streets in this weather. It's unconscionable. And I don't get it. You guys, as I understand it, and Laura, forgive me if I'm wrong here, but you've lived most of your lives, if not all of your lives, in this country. I find it's, how is this happening? And we're not all constantly protesting about it. In South Africa, where we do have a democracy, at least in electoral terms, we don't in economic terms as yet. There are still huge divisions which are racially defined. But we have very incompetent, corrupt governments, not as bad as they were under apartheid, but not as good as they should be. We have about 18 social protests every day. Because people don't just sit back. We engineered and successfully engineered a revolution. And people want to hold their representatives locally and nationally to account. So they protest where the money's disappeared. And the councillor who was responsible for that money turns up in his new Mercedes 4x4 or whatever it is. Yeah. And I experience, and I feel bad saying this because I am an outsider. I wasn't born in this country. There's a sense of apathy that really worries me.
I think what's also quite perverse is that we see this huge disparity between the living standards of these people who are so incredibly wealthy and continue to gain and hoard more wealth, and the majority of people whose day-to-day lives are getting harder, they're having to work longer just to sustain the basic, level of standards of living that they're achieving. But we've been brought to a place where, as a population, we are told that wealth is just through hard work, and to idolize that and to completely revere the money as if it's the be all and end all. So rather than, like you say, be disgusted with these people and have that huge outrage socially and be out on the streets protesting, how can we change things? People have been so convinced with hard work, you can do this. You're just not working hard enough. There must be something more that you can do. And that these people are to be, put up on a pedestal as something to really admire. And I think that's what's quite perverse about it, that we've been told that that's something to admire, rather than there's a flaw in the system that is, putting you in this position.
Yeah, I think as well, there's a slight problem when we say, oh, we've got poor people in this country who rely on food banks and stuff, whilst there's billionaires. I think we have poor people who struggle in this country because there's billionaires.
Yeah.
But for some people to have extreme amounts of resources, there has to be a lot of people on the other side of the scale who absolutely fuck all. And that's the problem. We don't link the two together. We don't see people suffering and link it to Elon Musk having that stuff. And
yeah,
I think many times I get people, so I teach with the trade union movement, people on courses who say these billionaires have made money, and I ask them, how much money do you think Jeff Bezos has ever made? And people throw out all wild figures. He's never made a penny. Workers have made his money for him. He's exploited other people to create the vast amounts of rewards.
Well, let's look at Donald Trump. Okay. Donald Trump is the son of a multimillionaire. If he had put the money that his father left him under his bed and left it there, he would be a lot wealthier today than he is. He's been declared bankrupt 7 times. I mean, the guy, and it's obvious to all of us who have the misfortune to overhear anything he ever says, but the guy's a moron. The fact that he has a huge ego and that he appeared on reality TV and that he's quite good at marketing himself to other incredibly stupid business people, because that's all he does. It's the Trump name. That's all he ever sells. Never actually done any meaningful business in his life. This somehow makes him a hero. I mean, please, living in this country as I have, I mean, I've done a lot of things in my life. So I've been in government, in the public sector in South Africa. I've had a lot of contact with people in the public sector in this country. I've even worked in the financial sector because that's part of my background. So I've seen people who get paid ridiculous sums of money and how hard or otherwise they work. I mean, they certainly play hard. But if you have to say to me, who are the people who really work hard in this country? I'll say to you, well, first and foremost, the nurses I see when I go to an NHS hospital, working under the most appalling conditions because of the mismanagement and the lack of funds going into the NHS, where we've replaced medical people with basically corporate managers at the top end of the health service, which is absurd, just like we have in education. It's those nurses who I see working like I've never seen human beings work, except maybe in mines in South Africa and here back in the day. And then, I think of the teachers at my kids' school when they were younger, at state schools where some of the teachers just give absolutely everything and are in a state of permanent exhaustion because, again, there is so little invested in education. And again, we think leadership is about corporate leadership. And we idolize these people. And, it reminds me of, I was fortunate enough to go to Cambridge here, to King's College, which was then still quite a radical place. It certainly isn't today. And, the Cambridge Five, the communist spies, all came from there, from King's College. And there used to be a flag that belonged to one of them up in the pub in the college. It was taken down a few years ago. You won't be surprised to hear. But I do remember an economics professor of mine saying in one of our first lectures, he said, just remember that behind every hugely successful business is a hugely successful crime. And boy, oh boy, was he right. I think there are a lot of small businesses that are really run on the sweat, tears, and blood of the people who run them. But, when we talk about these, I mean, what is Elon Musk's great skill? Elon Musk's great skill is turning, with the help of the government, turning public money, our money, tax money, into private profit. That's what he's good at. The Pentagon invested in the building of his cars, which are actually very good electric cars. But the reality is that, if it wasn't for the state funding of his businesses, he wouldn't be where he is today. And where he is today is bloody terrifying. No human being should be in that position, have that much money, and now have this much influence over a brain-dead president. I mean, it's absolutely terrifying. And what is so interesting, if you look at these guys, both Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, who I think might be even more evil, the Palantir guy, amongst other things. So there was an article recently that pointed out that Elon Musk is South African. He grew up at a very privileged school in Pretoria with all the privileges of white South Africa around him, and his family left the country before we became a democracy. God forbid. So, in a very racist environment. And then Peter Thiel, his grandfather, who lived in what was then Southwest Africa, which had been a German colony and then occupied by South Africa before it became independent as Namibia. The guy was an unreconstructed Nazi who moved from Canada to Southern Africa because he really liked the idea of apartheid. And these are the people we're supposed to look up to? I mean, give me a break. The people we should really all be looking up to are ordinary people who managed to survive in a state where we have a system of corporate welfarism Most of our money goes to corporates, where the state has abrogated its responsibility to ordinary people.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I want to try and move us on to some more positivity, which will be a massive shock for those listening and knowing my usually finishing on dire doom.
Usually have to save us last minute, Andrew, and just try and pull it back and try
No
and
problem.
get a bit of a positive messaging quite
No problem.
quite near the end.
I know there's a lot of interesting stuff going on post the election in Camden and stuff that was happening before, as there is across the country. I mean, we've had conversations about what we're doing up in the Northwest. So, talk us through what's going on with the community organising and the sort of exciting grassroots-led stuff happening down in Camden?
So, the first thing to say is it feels, and as we've been speaking, both within the country and globally, things feel really bad at the moment. It feels dark. But there's light within that darkness. And it feels terrible to say that because people are being murdered every day as we are speaking. Yeah. Goodness knows how many more people would have been slaughtered in Gaza or Lebanon. But at the same time, I think what is happening is the scales are falling from people's eyes. And that's why the independent movement during the election, which was unprecedented, we have 5 independent MPs. We've only had 2 in the last 55 years before the last election. Something is changing in the world. People are realizing that the whole blooming system is rigged. And, I don't think anyone again will look at Israel and think, wow, that's a great country. Unless you have this sort of blinkered vision of our politicians or of sort of ultra-Zionists who don't see the costs that Zionism brought in terms of the Nakba and the suffering of the last 76 years. But you're seeing it most of all in this country, you're seeing it at a local level where, for so many of these independent campaigns, the energy, the enthusiasm from volunteers, we had people down here working 20 hours a day. They were shattered for weeks and weeks. And that wasn't because they think, I'm the best thing since sliced bread. It was because they believe that things can't continue the way they are and that we could organize the world in a better way, starting locally. So what we've done post the election, we're in the process now. And I hope this doesn't sort of jump the announcement that we're going to make in a few weeks, but you can have a coup. We're launching something called the Camden Community Alliance. That's bringing together all of the community organizations and individuals in Camden to focus on the crises we face, on housing, on the NHS, on public transport, on education, on general inequality, which, Camden's a remarkably unequal area where, we have Keir Starmer's council giving Google a subsidy of £1.5 million to build a fancy new head office next to the council office while they're bashing down social and council housing and telling people they can give them alternative accommodation in Bolton when they've lived their entire lives in Camden. But we're trying to create a mechanism through which the community empowers itself. So there's going to be training in investigative methods to hold the council and to hold our MP to account. There's going to be training in community organizing, in organizing around housing issues, again, to hold our council to account. And I think it's incredibly exciting. And yeah, there will be an electoral element too, because what these entities will do is, when the 2026 local elections come around, there'll be a community structure in place where local representatives of our community, not some pompous, ego-driven politician, want to represent their community, which is an incredible honor to do, as Sean, as you know.
Absolutely.
We'll have a system in place where there'll be hustings, where people will be able to put themselves forward and the community will coalesce and unify around local candidates. And the idea of this is that these local initiatives, and I know what you're, for instance, doing in Southport, I know what people have been doing up in Liverpool for a while. I mean, you guys in the north are always way ahead of us in the south. We're far too comfortable down here. Is that all of these local initiatives will come together as a national movement. And then we decide together, the hundreds of thousands of us, we decide together how we move forward at a national level. Do we want to create a new political party to take on the really moribund, pathetic, corrupted political parties that we have? To introduce a new politics that really comes from the grassroots up. And to do that, we've got to ensure that it's a completely democratic process in what democratic is supposed to mean, so that nobody can hijack the process, and so that everybody has a voice. And I think if we manage to do this, we can change the nature and functioning of politics in this country. And we can say goodbye to those entitled, self-serving people who claim when it suits them every few years to represent us, and then spend their terms in office enriching themselves, their billionaire donors, and their corporate sponsors.
Absolutely. I think one thing I found really interesting in sort of my campaign up here was the use of assemblies and bringing people together to thrash it out. And that I was kind of dubious beforehand, having only ever been in the trade union movement and the Labour Party movement, where you kind of, them debates turn into mad arguments and people develop blood feuds for years. Seeing people actually constructively talk about the problems they've got, but then come up with the answer to the problems collectively, and seeing just how sort of, despite not always being people who would say themselves are on the left, come out with sort of left-wing answers to the issues, which in hindsight makes perfect sense, because if you've got a collective group of people together, they're going to come up with an answer that suits the collective, which is usually going to skew to the left. So I think looking at it when you step back, it makes perfect sense why they would come up with them answers. But I mean, the first thing on the list at the hustings I had in the general election before it was abolishing private education. And I was not thinking people in that room would ever in a million years come up with that. I was made up to see it because I think I'd moved that motion through my branch of the Labour Party years and years ago. It's good to see that come back up. But I think them sort of things, and you're right, I think that sort of pure democracy, local-led democracy feeding into representatives on the council or MPs when we can take them, is a really good base point for what could be a new political movement, party, whatever it ends up being. Yeah. I think that's, it's a different way of doing things where it's not sort of all whips and formalized nonsense. It's really interesting times to be involved in politics.
But you know, the other thing about that, and you mentioned sort of people's assemblies, what we in Camden call people's forums, borrowing from what we did in South Africa in the ANC, where before our 1994 election, we went around in these people's forums where we would just meet with the community, 300 to 500 people, and a few of the leaders would just sit in the middle and they would listen. And, you know, the ANC had to get 60-something% for me to be elected because we had a pure proportional representation system. And I remember sitting in some of those people's forums, and Mandela would say things like, you have to understand that we're not going to be able to deliver most of these things for many, many years to come. And I would sit there thinking, oh, come on, we've got to get 63% for me to have a job. You know, can't you just say, well, we're going to deliver a whole lot? And, you know, that showed my naivety and my political ambition at this point. It's much better to be involved in politics when you don't have any personal political ambitions. It's a much healthier thing. And what those forums and assemblies do, but they have to be facilitated the right way. And we're lucky that there are these people emerging from our communities who are really good at running these things. I'm not one of them. I obviously, as you've discovered tonight, I talk too much. And the key to it is making sure the middle-class, overeducated people like me don't dominate the conversations, because the reality is that I realize during this campaign every single day, doesn't matter how many degrees you have. There are people living on the streets of Camden. There are people in social and council housing. There are people doing some of the hardest jobs in the world who haven't had a fraction of my education, who are so much smarter than I am. And when it comes to the solutions we need to find together, collectively, as you said, as a society and communities, they are going to give far better inputs than I am ever going to get. And the reality, which, you know, was so central and is so central to everything that Jeremy Corbyn represents. I mean, this is the brilliance of the man, is he understands that making decisions, all of us talking together and thinking these things through, than one of us deciding, the decisions are always going to be better in the long run. And, you know, I suppose the challenge for us, and I'd be interested to hear your views on this, but the challenge for us is we've got to go outside our comfort zones, and we've got to go to the Clactons and the other places where a lot of people have voted for reform. And we've got to talk to the people who think that the Farages of this world are part of the solution, and explain to them why we think they're part of the problem and nothing to do with the solution. And that's hard work. That's Absolutely. The work we've got to do.
I agree 100%. And I've had this debate with many, many people since the Trump election, that we can't sort of bury our heads in the sand, call these people idiots, and expect them to ever put their faith in us. We've got to sort of address their needs, because the centrists aren't doing it. Labour won't do it here. The Democrats won't do it in America. We need to be able to communicate with people and communicate an answer to addressing the problems with their material needs and material conditions at the moment. Until we do that, we're never going to get anywhere. I think there is no problem with socialism apart from the language we use. We have to use language that people understand, normal people understand. So there's no point in talking about season and means of production when we can talk about worker ownership. I know what most people are going to understand every day of the week there. It's a matter of meeting people where they are, not expecting them to have the theory of socialist thinkers for the last 100 years. We've got to use language that everyday people use.
I think as well, Sean, just to sort of butt in a second, when you mention you know, looking for giving people the answers, even the step before that, giving people the voice to come out and be heard about what their concerns are, about what they think the solution should be, that in itself is giving people a massive like part of the democratic process, where before they're just ignored and not listened to. Them having that voice and that feeling of ownership of part of the process is massive in giving people that sort of that really involvement in the, you know, in the decision and the process.
That's so crucial. And, you know, when some of us as independents would, one of the things we said was, if you elect us, we'll undertake not just to come and tell you what we're doing in Parliament, which should be, you know, the bare minimum, having surgeries at least every week so that we can actually help people with their daily problems. But when there are votes on important issues in Parliament, coming back and talking to the community about those votes and what you think we should be doing as your representatives. Because otherwise, what is representative democracy? Then, with the technological advances we've made, we should rather start thinking of some form of more direct democracy, unless our representatives are constantly a part of their communities and are hearing what the community says. And yes, there's not always going to be consensus in a community, especially unequal and diverse communities. But just the principle of taking our lead from those communities. And, you know, to really try and end on a very positive note, because I think amidst all the gloom, there is positivity. And if I could just give you two very quick examples.
Yeah, go for it.
The Belgian Workers' Party, which, you know, the three of us know about, but a lot of people in Britain don't, In 2008, which wasn't that long ago, it was a tiny little marginalized left political movement that claimed to have 300 members. I think they added a zero there, but be that as it may, okay? And then they got a leader, and he said, you know what, let's take our political principles and never lose those principles or values. Let's find better ways to communicate them. Let's sort of update them. Let's update the nature of our politics so that the voices of working people can be heard in all of the legislatures in Belgium, because Belgium has about 6 parliaments, which I don't understand at all. 6 parliaments for a few hundred people, basically. But and in the last Belgian elections, across these various parliaments and the various levels of government, the Belgian Workers' Party went from having 5 representatives to having 248 representatives. But they won't operate electorally in a local area until they've worked there. And by working there, that means having free legal advice clinics, having free health centers, and actually giving something to those communities before they ask those communities for votes. And we can learn a lot from that. And then the second and final thing I'll say is that, you know, I'm often called naive and idealistic at the age of 60, which some people think is slightly embarrassing. I actually take it as a compliment. Because if it's naive and idealistic to believe that the way in which we organize our communities, our countries, our world can be better, can better serve all of humanity, then boy, oh boy, am I naive and idealistic. And the main reason I am is because I played a very, very minuscule role, along with tens of millions of others, in actually liberating a country from 340 years of racist oligarchy. And when I had to leave South Africa in the mid-80s, as I mentioned to you earlier on, to avoid military service, I remember thinking my last night in Cape Town, I'll never be able to set foot in the city or country of my birth again in my lifetime. Because at that point in 1986, the apartheid state seemed so powerful. The military seemed so powerful. It felt a bit like Israel does today. And the support from the West was horrible, but substantial, you know, because you had these awful right-wing governments across Western countries. And if anyone had said, yeah, you know, we're going to liberate this country, I would have offered them a straitjacket. It didn't make any sense. But 4 years later, our political prisoners were freed, the ANC was unbound, all our exiles could return. And a further 4 years after that, Nelson Mandela was elected our first ever democratic president. 8 years. And I was talking about my lifetime when I was in my early 20s. So I believe that change can happen. And sometimes the biggest change, the most revolutionary change, comes quite quickly after moments of incredible darkness. And that's the light that I think there is. You know, we look at the resilience, the extraordinary courage and strength of the Palestinian people. And that says something to us. That the world actually, you can kill as many of us as you like, but you will never defeat us. And that's how we need to start thinking. Because it's all part of the same system. And the fact that our taxes are being used to subsidize BAE's weapons, are being used to commit this genocide in Gaza. That's one of the reasons why there's not enough money for the NHS, for education, for public transport, et cetera, et cetera. So we must see the linkages between these things. And we must be brave enough to empower ourselves and empower our communities collectively together. And in that way, we can change the nature and functioning of British politics. And boy, they're going to be sick of us naive idealists when we are the many and they are the few.
That's absolutely perfect place for us to finish there, Andrew. But thank you for coming on. It's been a really amazing show. I hope you come on again sometime.
Oh, I would love to. There's lots more to talk about. Thanks so much for having me on and for doing this show. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I'll be listening to you far more than I have.
Amazing. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Take care, everyone.